Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Anatomy and Physiology podcast. We're going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system today. It's going to be a short episode of the podcast here. We're just going to outline what is the autonomic nervous system, what are its major subdivisions, and what do those do. Before we jump into that, though, let's talk about the difference between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So overall, the breakdown of the entire nervous system is that there's the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. Everything outside of the brain and spinal cord is in the peripheral nervous system. We have neurons going towards the central nervous system and away from the central nervous system, and those get broken down into their own smaller categories of information going towards the central nervous system is within the sensory or afferent division of the peripheral nervous system. That means that information going away from the central nervous system, that's going to be in the motor or efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. And that motor or efferent division has two major types. We can send out motor information to stuff that's under voluntary control, like our skeletal muscles, or we can send motor information out to stuff that's under involuntary control. These are things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, that kind of stuff. So let's now talk about the difference between that somatic, voluntary side of the motor division and then the autonomic, involuntary side. So when we look at these two divisions, it's kind of easy to tell the difference between whether we have a somatic motor neuron or an autonomic motor neuron, because one of the major differences between these two divisions is that they have different effector organs. And we've already described them, right? The somatic motor nervous system sends information to voluntary effector organs, and those are going to be our skeletal muscles. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, we're sending motor information out to stuff that's under involuntary control, like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. But in addition to just having different effectors, we can also tell that these neurons are in two different divisions because they look different as well. When we look at the neurons themselves, they look very different. So even if we don't know where the neuron ends up, we can look at these neurons and say, oh, look, this one must be an involuntary one of the autonomic nervous system, or that must be a voluntary neuron of the somatic nervous system. And here's how we know that. Neurons in the somatic nervous system, they have what's called a single neuron chain. And full disclosure, they still have two neurons here, but the first neuron of that chain, it starts up in our pre-central gyrus in the motor cortex of our frontal lobe in our cerebrum. And that information starts and gets sent out through the upper motor neuron. And that upper motor neuron starts in the brain, and then it works its way down the spinal cord. And while it's inside the spinal cord, it synapses with the second motor neuron. And that second motor neuron cell body is within the central nervous system. And then its axon leaves the central nervous system, goes out into the periphery, or out into our peripheral nervous system, and then it innervates all of our skeletal muscles. Well, different neurons innervate different skeletal muscles. And, one neuron can innervate a couple or a bunch of muscle fibers. So there's tons of neurons that do this, but each motor unit that we're going to activate has essentially one neuron that is outside of the central nervous system. And in fact, we don't see any cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, so we don't see any ganglions on these nerves that innervate skeletal muscle. And that's very different from the neurons in the autonomic nervous system. When we look at the neurons in the autonomic nervous system, we say that they are what is called a double neuron chain, as opposed to that single neuron chain in the somatic nervous system. And this double neuron chain means that the first neuron starts out in the central nervous system, but its axon exits the central nervous system and goes out into the peripheral nervous system, and then it synapses with the second motor neuron. And because that second motor neuron is completely out in the peripheral nervous system, that means its cell body is out there too. And when we have cell bodies out in the peripheral nervous system, in order to make room for that cell body in those nerves that are sending out information into the body, we need to make a little bump on that nerve for space for that cell body. And that little bump on a nerve, we know what that is. It's a ganglion. So when we look at the nerves that innervate somatic and autonomic nervous systems, we can see a ganglion on the ones that are autonomically innervated. And in addition to that, if we look at the neurons that are out in the peripheral nervous system, the somatic motor neurons, the ones that are under voluntary control, are heavily myelinated. They have a bunch of and really thick myelin sheaths all the way down their axons. That means that those axons are protected by the myelin sheath, but also it speeds up the flow of information to our skeletal muscles, which makes the signal getting sent to those skeletal muscles very, very fast. Super fast to send information out to our skeletal muscles. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, the first neuron that exits the spinal cord, that one has a little bit of myelin sheath on it, but not as much as the somatic nervous system. And really key here is that the second neuron in this double neuron chain in the autonomic nervous system, the second neuron is unmyelinated, meaning that this flow of information through that second neuron tends to be very slow, much, much slower than in the somatic nervous system. And we're probably familiar with that, right? Like when we want to move our muscles, that signal is sent really fast and it's almost instantaneous. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, changes in heart rate, for example, can take a little while to speed up the heart rate or slow down the heart rate, and that's partly due because of the second neuron being unmyelinated. It just takes a little bit longer to send information through the autonomic nervous system. The final difference between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system is the neurotransmitters that get sent out in each one of these two systems. And we know that in the somatic motor nervous system, we use acetylcholine. And that acetylcholine always just stimulates the muscle to contract. Very simple. The upper motor and lower motor neurons, they release acetylcholine, and specifically that second neuron out in the peripheral nervous system, it releases acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, and it excites the skeletal muscle. In fact, it excites it so much that it just causes it to contract. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, given that we have two neurons outside of the central nervous system, and we have that ganglion, we have the ability to release a neurotransmitter at two different points. We can release a neurotransmitter between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron, and we can release neurotransmitter from the postganglionic neuron directly onto the effector organ. And given that we have like a little bit more nuance here, we've got two different spots that we can release neurotransmitter. That's slightly different. And we have two different neurotransmitters that we can release in the autonomic nervous system. We can release acetylcholine, and there's a new one now that we can release called norepinephrine. Norepinephrine. And norepinephrine, we say norepinephrine in the United States. If you're studying around the world, you might call this stuff noradrenaline. And these are very similar to adrenaline and epinephrine, which are hormones of the endocrine system. And it's basically the same molecule. It's just released in really small amounts as neurotransmitters. So we use norepinephrine. You've probably heard noradrenaline or adrenaline. These are the adrenaline-like neurotransmitters. And what's cool about releasing acetylcholine and norepinephrine is that sometimes either acetylcholine or norepinephrine can be excitatory and cause that effector organ to contract or perform its function, or it can be inhibitory, causing that effector organ to stop contracting or stop producing its function. So again, the major differences between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system would be the effector organs that they stimulate, the efferent pathways that they take, the neuron chains, and then the neurotransmitters that they release. So while we're talking about neurotransmitters, let's talk about within the autonomic nervous system. Because we have two different neurotransmitters that can be released, we need different kinds of receptors that can detect the differences between these neurotransmitters and then can do different things with that information. And the two major neurotransmitters of the autonomic nervous system are cholinergic receptors and adrenergic receptors. Cholinergic and adrenergic. And here's how I remember these ones. Cholinergic are stimulated by acetylcholine. think cholinergic and acetylcholine. These ones, if an organ has cholinergic receptors, they can be stimulated by acetylcholine. And these are, it's not this straightforward, but these are more commonly found in parasympathetic effectors or have parasympathetic effects. Whereas adrenergic receptors, these are the ones that detect adrenaline-like neurotransmitters, which are epinephrine, and the one that we're going to be talking about is norepinephrine, which was that other neurotransmitter of the autonomic nervous system. So these adrenaline-like adrenergic receptors, these ones are found a little bit more in sympathetic responses, which we're going to talk about in a second. And while we're talking about this, I do just want to clarify that cholinergic receptors, when we learn about this further down the road, remember that these can be either nicotinic or muscarinic cholinergic receptors. And whereas adrenergic receptors can be either alpha or beta adrenergic receptors. And so we'll talk about that more later on. Okay, now let's talk about the difference between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now we're within the autonomic nervous system, looking at these two subdivisions that are sort of opposite sides of the same coin. They innervate the same structures, and they have usually opposite effects on that structure. So here's the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. First, in the sympathetic nervous system, this nervous system is really good at amping us up, getting us excited, and getting us ready to perform physical activities. So the way that I remember the effect or the functions of the sympathetic nervous system is it's the 4 Fs. The 4 Fs. This might be like a fight response, where you get really pumped up to fight off a predator or an attacker. This could be like a flight response, where you get really pumped up to run away from something. There's also a freeze response in the sympathetic nervous system, where your body essentially kind of shuts down and your brain slows down its processing of information. And hopefully whatever is causing that freeze response then moves on and leaves after a while, after we've frozen. And then finally, the last F is going to be sexual reproduction. And those are going to be things related to like increased blood flow to sexual organs, erections, orgasms, ejaculations, that kind of stuff. All 4 of those effects are stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. And I should clarify that sexual reproduction is interesting because it has sympathetic and parasympathetic functions at the same time. So it's not quite as straightforward as we made it out to be there, but I think it's a nice way to remember the 4 Fs of the sympathetic nervous system. But besides just the functions of the sympathetic nervous system, when we look at the neurons that cause these sympathetic effects that we just described, they look very different than the autonomic nerves of the parasympathetic nervous system. And here's the difference. When we look at the places on the spinal cord where these nerves exit, all of the neurons that have these sympathetic responses, they all exit between T1 and L2 on the spinal cord. So they're right in the middle of the spinal cord, and we call that the thoracolumbar area of the spinal cord, in between the thoracic and the top of the lumbar area. And so when the nerves exit this area and go out to the heart, for example, we're going to know that that neuron must be a sympathetic neuron because it originates in the thoracolumbar area. In addition to that, the ganglions of where the first neuron and the second neuron synapse together, they're oftentimes, in fact, they're usually really close to the spinal cord. So the first neuron exits the spinal cord, and then just off of the spinal cord, we can see where that ganglion is, the bump on the nerve for the cell body of the postganglionic neuron. So again, these neurons are thoracolumbar, and their ganglions are very close to the spinal cord, and they elicit those 4 Fs of their functions. And those are different from the parasympathetic neurons. When we see parasympathetic neurons going out to their effector organs and causing that parasympathetic response, the response that we see from these types of neurons is more of like a rest and digest. It's the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. This one's trying to calm us down, prepare us for relaxing, resting, maybe even falling asleep, and then maybe digesting, which would be, while we're resting, would be a great time to digest food because it actually takes quite a bit of energy to initiate the digestion process. So we really don't want to be spending energy on digesting when we're really amped up trying to run away from a predator. We'll save that energy expense for when we're calm, chilled out, and relaxing. In addition to having different functions, the ganglions of the parasympathetic nervous system are really far away from the spinal cord. Whereas in the sympathetic nervous system, they're just off the spinal cord. But if we see one of these neurons going way far out and getting very close to the effector organ, and then it has a ganglion, those are oftentimes parasympathetic neurons that have those parasympathetic functions. Sometimes the ganglion of these things are even inside of the effector organ. And so you wouldn't even really see them unless you looked inside of the organ. So they're very far away from the spinal cord. And then finally, the area that these neurons exit the spinal cord is not in the thoracolumbar region like the sympathetic nervous system was. They're what we call craniosacral. Cranio meaning from the brainstem, and then sacral meaning way down below in the sacral region of the spinal cord. So again, major differences here. Where these neurons exit the brain and the spinal cord, if they're from the thoracolumbar region, they're sympathetic, and if they're from the craniosacral region, these are parasympathetic. Another difference is where the ganglions live on these things. If the ganglion is just off of the spinal cord, that's a sympathetic neuron and has a sympathetic response. And then if it's really far away from the spinal cord or even inside of the effector organ, we would say that those are parasympathetic neurons that have parasympathetic functions. And then, by the way, the functions of these two neurons are different. They innervate the same organs. They both go to the heart or the lungs or the GI tract, but they do different things. We've got the 4 F's of the sympathetic nervous system: fight, flight, freeze, and reproduction, whereas the the parasympathetic functions are our rest and digest. So I'd like us to know the difference between these things, and kind of what's interesting about these two systems is that they innervate or go to and stimulate the same organs. And that's different from the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system that just innervate two different things. These two are kind of interesting because they innervate the same things, and we'd say that this is dual innervation, meaning that these organs have both sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons running to it, and these sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons do different things. And so let's now just kind of use some examples of this dual innervation to figure out like how these two systems innervate the same organs. Let's look at maybe the cardiovascular system with like heart and blood vessels. We'll talk about the respiratory system with lungs and bronchi, and we'll talk digestive system, sweat glands, pupils. I think that's probably a good list for us to know about. And so you can practice this yourself. Pause the podcast and see if you can take those organ systems and describe how a sympathetic neuron would act on that organ and how a parasympathetic stimulation would act on that same organ. So let's take the cardiovascular system. If we're looking at heart rate, how would the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems affect heart rate? Well, remember, the sympathetic nervous system is amping us up for fight or flight, so we're going to see an increase in heart rate from the sympathetic stimulation. And then parasympathetically, we're going to be decreasing heart rate, calming us down, not spending so much energy pumping blood around the body. Let's calm down, get ready for resting and digesting. Blood vessels are kind of interesting. I think a simplified way that we could look at it is the sympathetic stimulation of blood vessels might be to make them constrict and increase blood pressure, whereas parasympathetic stimulation might be to relax them, dilate them, and go easier on those blood vessels, because high blood pressure can be difficult and damage these blood vessels. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Sympathetic innervation of these blood vessels happens in two different ways. We constrict the blood vessels that are in our digestive system and other internal organs and reduce the blood flow to those because we don't really want to be doing that digestion right there. And then typically we dilate the blood vessels of our brain and our skeletal muscles and get them ready for physical activity. But I'm totally fine with that little bit of an oversimplification that we talked about earlier. Now let's talk about the lungs and then the bronchi, or the tubes that allow air to flow in and out of the lungs. So how would the sympathetic nervous system affect maybe respiratory rate, the speed with which we're breathing? Well, sympathetic innervation of our lungs might increase respiratory rate, get us more air, more oxygen into our bloodstream. That's hopefully going to be fueling our muscles to like run away from something or fight off a predator. But remember, it's not always a good idea just to have tons of oxygen surging around through our bloodstream. Oxygen is a highly volatile molecule, and carbon dioxide leads to or can alter our pH levels. So typically with parasympathetic stimulation of respiratory rate, we see that would decrease and lower the amount of oxygen in our blood and get us ready for sleeping, where we hardly use any energy at all. And then the bronchi, or the tubes that allow air to flow in and out of the lungs, those also get affected by sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation. During sympathetic stimulation, those bronchi dilate and open up and allow for tons of air to flow in and out of them, whereas in parasympathetic stimulation, they constrict and they allow less air to flow into them because we don't need as much air when we're resting and digesting. Next up, let's talk about digestive system. Maybe we can highlight two major areas. Let's talk about maybe gastric motility, or the speed with which we move food and waste through the GI tract. And then maybe we'll talk about gastric secretions of the enzymes that are going to be breaking food down. Both of these two things can require quite a bit of energy to do these processes. And when we're trying to fight off predators or run away from stuff during sympathetic stimulation, we really don't want to be putting any energy into digesting stuff. We want to make sure that we're going to be alive after this encounter. So we're going to probably decrease gastric motility and decrease the amount of digestive secretions that we have in order to preserve energy. Whereas during parasympathetic stimulation, we're resting and we're ready to spend some extra energy to digest some food and maybe hopefully get some macronutrients and energy back. It would be a great time to increase gastric motility and increase digestive secretions. Sweat glands, let's talk about sweat glands next. This one is kind of interesting. It can act a little bit differently than other sympathetic functions. But I think at a surface level, we can just say that sweat glands, when they are sympathetically activated, they are going to start increasing their sweat production and sweat secretion in order to cool the body down for the big physical activity that we're assuming could show up. Like if we plan on running away from something or fighting off a predator, your body might start secreting sweat in order to pre-cool our body for this big physical activity that we're about to go through. And then for parasympathetic stimulation, sweat glands kind of have no real function, but I think it's fine for us to think about sweat glands decreasing their activity during parasympathetic functions. And last but not least, let's talk about pupil constriction and dilation in our eyes. And remember, the pupils are created by that iris, a pair of smooth muscles that can constrict and dilate and allow more or less light to flow into the eyes. During sympathetic stressful events, we might notice that our pupils dilate and allow tons of light to come into the eye in an attempt to hopefully be able to see our surroundings really well and pick up as much sensory information as we can get. We can see the predators approaching us, or we can pick and choose the path that we need to run away from this predator or attacker. But having those pupils dilated a lot can be really hard on the retina in the back of our eyes. Too much light hitting them can be harmful or damaging. And it's really hard to rest and fall asleep when our pupils are really dilated. So during parasympathetic stimulation, we can constrict the pupils and allow less light to hit the back of the eye. And that's going to preserve the retina as well as prepare us for resting and maybe even falling asleep. So again, I'd like us to be able to maybe describe the major effects of each one of those things, whether they're parasympathetically or sympathetically activated. And I got to be honest, I don't think you need to memorize every single one of those. If you're struggling to understand maybe how one works, like the bronchi constricting and dilating, you could maybe memorize that. But otherwise, you could kind of just walk through each one, and if you understand the functions of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, I think you'll be able to kind of deduce the effect of each one of those organ systems. Okay, I think that's going to kind of be it for the autonomic nervous system. Kind of a short episode here, but good luck studying, and I will see us all soon.